Welcome to the Be Bold podcast. I'm Beth Whitman. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Be Bold podcast. Today's conversation is with Dr. Sally Fisher. I'll tell you a bit about her in just a moment. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. This is where I feature in-person, in-depth conversations with women who have inspirational stories to share. These are women who are forward-thinking and forging their own paths to success. Now, these ladies, they come from a wide range of backgrounds, and we cover many topics, including travel, adventure, spirituality, music, athletics, and in the case of today's guest, nutrition. So they come from a wide range of backgrounds and find themselves in an equally wide range of stages in their lives. The one thread they have in common is that they are bold in what they do. They follow what they love, and somehow they've managed to create a lifestyle that supports it. And it's when you hear these stories about and from other people that we become inspired and our knowledge and community grows, and really it makes us feel like anything is possible. I believe we all have the ability to become better versions of ourselves, and what I'm hoping is that you'll find pearls of wisdom in these conversations, just bits of information that inspire and motivate you. And I'm hoping you'll hear something that makes you want to change and make choices in your life that ultimately makes you happier and more fulfilled. So today's guest, Sally Fisher. I met Sally about 1.5 years ago when I stayed at Sunrise Springs Spa Resort, and this is located just outside of Santa Fe. At Sunrise Springs, she's the medical director where she sees clients and also teaches about health and wellness to visitors who are staying at the resort. And Sally has a special interest and expertise in the power of plant-based diets as medicine. And of course, that was of interest to me. So I took her class on gut health while I was there. We immediately clicked, and I've been so eager since launching this podcast to sit down with her for a chat. And I was so glad when our calendars aligned, I was able to chat with her during my recent trip to New Mexico. And it was in her office in Albuquerque that we got a chance to meet up and actually record this. Now, what I love about Sally is that she really has quite a no-nonsense approach to a plant-based diet. Always, she brings it around to the science and the data, which is irrefutable in terms of what a healthy diet can be. In this conversation, we talk about many things encompassing nutrition, including the difference between a gluten sensitivity and celiac disease, as well as the addictive properties of foods, including dairy, Oreos, and other foods that are engineered to keep us eating. And something I learned about these addictive foods is that we actually build up a tolerance for them and then need more of them to stay satiated. I just didn't realize that. And that's why you can't just eat one when it comes to potato chips or Girl Scout cookies. I loved her advice about making big changes versus small ones. And you'll hear her talk about how and have very sound reasoning behind this, why she believes bigger changes are stickier, they last longer than smaller ones. Before you hear our conversation, just a quick reminder that if you are new to the podcast, please subscribe. That tells your podcast provider that this show is of value and it helps other people find it. Subscribing is free and it's easy, and you'll be doing me a solid if you do so. Also, tell a friend about this episode or the podcast in general. You can find all the episodes at beboldpodcast.com, and that includes show notes with links to books, people, and websites mentioned during the podcast. With that, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Sally Fisher. So what I would love to know is, because I know you're primarily plant-based, you are plant-based, I'm primarily plant-based. Tell me what's in your favorite salad.
Okay. So I'm a haphazard cook and a haphazard eater. So if one goes to Trader Joe's and buys, a bag of sweet potatoes and a bag of, say, pumpkin seeds and maybe a bag of avocados and then a bag of the pre-washed greens, and at one period of time in the week you steam up all the sweet potatoes, then really you grab hold of greens, you throw it into the bowl, you chop up a sweet potato, you chop up an avocado, you throw in...
You've boiled the potatoes.
The sweet potatoes, I steam them,
Okay,
actually.
you steam them, okay.
Like, even in the Instant Pot, which I'm sort of a newfound card-carrying cult member of. The real key is to try to make one of Joel Furman's delicious nut dressings, sort of raw nuts and acid, vinegar or lemon juice and different flavors, blueberries or herbs. And that way you're using sort of your handful of nuts, not eating it out of hand, but spreading its delicious goodness all over the salad.
That sounds wonderful. Do you have a book from him that you can recommend?
All his books are wonderful, and all his books contain those famous raw nut recipes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. I'll link to those in the show notes so people can find those easily. But that sounds really good. I think sometimes people think that they have to make their meals really complicated.
No.
And that doesn't sound complicated.
No. And today, I have a $1.99 bunch of organic beets that I bought. So I steamed the beets and steamed the greens and threw a bunch of fresh dill, some cashew yogurt, and some Trader Joe's pomegranate vinegar in a blender. And I had some raw and some steamed beets, and a sprout mixture, broccoli sprouts and radish sprouts. And then I drenched it in this dill dressing.
Oh my gosh.
So good.
Wow. I have to tell you, I just discovered broccoli sprouts. So last time I saw you was about, I think it was I don't even know if it was
a while ago.
Yeah,
I think it was longer.
It was a year and a half ago because I know we didn't get to see each other last year when I was down here. It was a year and a half ago, I think September. And since then I've discovered broccoli sprouts. And let's talk about that because I think they are so important. I sprout my own. I got a sprouter off of Amazon and I've constantly got a rotation of broccoli sprouts going. Can you talk about the properties of what makes them so wonderful?
Yeah. So if we have this so-called drug detoxification system. But when we evolved...
We meaning humans.
Humans,
not,
exactly.
Not big pharma.
No, humans. And when we evolved this system, there was no Tylenol or ibuprofen or cocaine or whatever drugs we needed to detoxify and get rid of. And so actually the plant kingdom, plants are chemical factories. They make all sorts of potent chemicals in their own defense. They need to defend themselves against ultraviolet radiation and oxidation and fungi and insects and so forth. And so they make these complex chemicals. They're chemical factories. And these chemicals have biologic activity in our body. And in broccoli sprouts, there's a group of chemicals that we literally need to get rid of. In fact, in any given day, I'm going to give you medical advice here. You don't want to have more than 4 cups of broccoli sprouts because of the presence of these potent chemicals. So we created the detoxification system so that we could successfully eat broccoli and their sprouts and get rid of an accumulation of these potent chemicals. Consequently, every time you have broccoli sprouts, you are upping your ability to detoxify ubiquitous environmental chemicals, excess sex steroid hormones like estrogen, which might otherwise feed breast cancer, other sort of internal waste. So you are amping up the detoxification system by eating broccoli sprouts. And that's literally why we have a detoxification system.
Wow. And is that the sulforaphane?
Yes.
Is that
right.
Is there beyond sulforaphane? Is there anything else that's a property that's detoxing, helping detox?
No, it's really those potent chemicals that the detoxification system is detoxifying.
But you're saying not to have more than 4 cups.
Yeah.
A day. I mean, no,
right,
I don't come anywhere near
right,
that.
Because those chemicals are concentrated in the sprouts.
Okay.
So 4 cups of the sprouts, because literally we do need to get rid of it. It would be problematic in excess.
I see.
So,
do you grow your own?
No, I always tell people I'm a haphazard cook. I'm a haphazard eater. I buy the sprouts.
Wow.
It's
so easy.
I know.
So easy.
I know.
I have them growing in my office.
Know.
I'm going to also, you know what? I'm going to post a picture of my little grout throwing operation.
And then I was at someone's house and she had something that looked like a wine cooler that was a sprout, a little, like it sort of fits in like a dishwasher space under your counter with a glass. And she had these gorgeous sprouts growing there. So there's a whole world of home sprouting.
It looked like a what?
Like a wine, like you put bottles of wine in. It was it was like this built-in thing under her counter, and she had these gorgeous sprouts of all different sorts.
I'd recently heard that adding daikon radish sprouts to the broccoli sprouts even enhances it even more. Have you heard that?
I have not. A little tidbit that I'm familiar with is that when you cook cruciferous vegetables, you're inactivating the enzyme that takes groups of chemicals from sort of a pre-form into the more active form. And that mustard seed actually contains that enzyme. Mustard seed's sort of in that class of that family. And so if you put a little mustard seed on your cooked broccoli or your cooked cauliflower, then you can still generate these biologically beneficial compounds that would not be generated in the absence of having the enzyme there, which you've sort of cooked out.
Wow. There's a lot to know, isn't there?
Not really. Not really.
It seems like it.
Just eat the plant foods. Just eat the plant foods.
Well, let's talk about, Sally, because I do feel like it can be really overwhelming. And I think I know more than the average person. And I still feel like, oh my gosh, like I didn't know about the mustard seeds. Let's start with your background. What is your current position? And then how did you find yourself there over the years? How did you get into exactly what you're doing?
Okay. Well, I'll sort of start in the past. I think I was always really interested in nutrition. I mean, I know I was. I recall being sort of a young teenager and reading books on nutrition. And I think that when I reflect on that, I think that as an adolescent, the world is a bit confusing, and that I always loved nature, and that I think sort of these whole gorgeous plant foods, like the berries of the forest, are sort of these reiterations of nature in sort of a microcosmic way. And I always found that really appealing, and I always found that really clear, that it was beautiful and health-giving. And, in college, I went to Yale. It was the Yale Hunger Action Project, because hunger just seemed like an issue that was, you couldn't really have an argument about it. It was just on such a fundamental level wrong. So always this sort of attraction to the beauty of nature and the beauty of nature as it manifested in the plant kingdom. And when I went to college, I actually had to meet with the dean. I initially went to a small women's college on the East Coast, and I had to go talk to the dean about my career plans. And I said that I wanted to be a nutritionist. And she said, oh, well, the nutritionist isn't number one on the medical team. And here at our fine college, we are always number one. So you have to become a physician. And I was confused by that message. And as it turns out, I did go to medical school. And as it turns out, there is virtually no nutrition education in medical school. But I'm certainly glad that that was my education. And I'm thrilled that I was able to make my way into doing nutrition as a physician.
So you're happy that you had that background as a medical doctor, but that you eventually found your way into nutrition. How did you do that? Did you practice as a medical practitioner?
So I went to my residency after medical school was in preventive medicine. And there actually is the American Society of Physician Nutrition Specialists. And it's this tiny group. I like to say there's a physician nutritionist for every 1.5 million Americans. I mean, it's absurdly
heart-wrenching
small, but there is certainly a home for nutrition in medicine. It's just a very tiny, tiny home. So my residency is in preventive medicine. I later got board certified in integrative and holistic medicine and as a physician nutrition specialist. And currently I have a private practice in Albuquerque. I do a lot of teaching, lecturing, and I am the medical director at a beautiful wellness resort called Sunrise Springs Spa Resort in Santa Fe, where I really have the pleasure of teaching people who come to the resort. We have classes all day long, and I do these health and wellness classes with names like food as medicine and gut health, and I have actually a class on detoxification.
And I think that's where I met you. I think I took your class on gut health when I was there.
Probably the gut health one, which is sort of universally, there's a lot of interest in it because I think people are really struggling in so many ways with their gut health. And then I do see people one-on-one.
So with your practice in Albuquerque, how are people finding you, or what are they coming to see you for?
I do a lot of lecturing locally, so often people hear me and then come to see me. And, I think there's a large, complex group of complaints of suffering that people are having that is not being adequately addressed in sort of the 7-minute visit. And that can relate to autoimmunity, gut health, fatigue, these sort of complex chronic conditions that don't kill people immediately, so don't sort of generate a lot of alarm in medical circles more conventionally.
So sorry to interrupt. So people aren't feeling well.
They're not feeling well.
They haven't figured out why.
Right.
And they think something that you've said or they've read about you or nutrition in general resonates with them, and they think, let me see if this is the problem. Right.
Sort of a more root cause, looking a little bit deeper at root cause. And food is the best kept secret in medicine. Mm-hmm. I mean, its potential to obviously do harm when it's negative, the way it is in sort of the culture generally, and its potential for, health promotion, restoration is just huge.
As you said, food is medicine. Mm-hmm. Where do you start with someone?
Well, you want to sort of have a sense for all these sort of complex symptoms that people potentially have seen as separate. They might come in and complain of one thing and mention a number of other things, and I absolutely see them as connected. So obviously the history in the interview is really key. In terms of food, I just ask people what they've eaten in the last 24 hours. Sometimes I ask them what they've eaten in the 24 hours before that, but you get a pretty good idea.
Do you think people are pretty honest about it?
Yeah, there's often the comment like, "Oh, it was a really bad day,"
but every day's a bad day.
But every day's a bad day.
I know, or they were on vacation.
Yeah, right. There's it's a vacation. Yeah.
And then out at Sunrise, you do classes. So it's small groups that you're talking to in terms of this. And there's probably just a little bit more, because it's a little bit more of an open environment. They're probably coming to you out of curiosity rather than a targeted issue.
Right. I do go around the room. So, I sort of assign topics to these classes, but I really want to tailor it to the people there. So I'll go around the room and ask sort of what intrigued people, if they want to share that about the title gut health or the title detoxification or food as medicine. And sometimes people share specific things, which I do try to address as much as possible, but obviously it's a very different setting than a one-on-one consultation. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's an enormous amount of curiosity, and people have heard so much conflicting information. And
well, who do you trust when there's so much conflicting
The medical research. It's the only ground I can stand on. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely the only ground I can stand on.
But wouldn't the argument say for people who are, let's say, not ketone eaters, what's the other one that all
Paleo?
The CrossFit? Yeah, paleo. Thank you. Wouldn't a paleo eater come to you and say, but look, I've got the research here that shows that we evolved from a paleo diet. We should be on a paleo diet. And this is what the research is showing.
I think any diet any diet that's being promoted, you can go to the research and you can pick some evidence that promotes your argument. Sort of anyone who's honest in the field of nutrition has to take a step back and look at the overwhelming balance of the evidence, which is that the more whole plant foods are part of people's diets, the better their outcomes. Also, you have to just fundamentally question the underlying premise that we ate meat 3 times a day. We know that we ate an inordinate amount of plant foods. Americans on average get 15 grams of fiber a day. And we're going to use fiber as a proxy for the consumption of plant foods, because fiber, we'll use that as a shorthand for the entirety of non-digestible components of plant foods. And there is ubiquitously fiber in plant foods. Plants don't have skeletons. They can't exist as pools of liquid on the ground. And so they have these fibrous components. Animal foods never have any fiber. Animal cell membranes use cholesterol as their structural element, and plants have cell walls that use these non-digestible carbohydrates, that's their chemical structure, for their structure. And so 15 grams a day on average for Americans. That means 97% of Americans are deficient in it.
How many should we be getting?
They have odd numbers like 25 for women and 35 grams for men. But we actually know historically people got 150 grams a day, massive amounts. So yeah, you killed animals when you were able to kill animals, but for the most part, what was much more dependable were the roots and the tubers and the wild greens and so forth.
So it might be once a week, actually, that they were eating meat.
Right. It would be much more sporadic and less dependable than the plant foods. So we actually have really no data that humans were uniformly having it 3 meals a day.
With scrambled eggs and bacon.
Yes. 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 Yeah.
Before we started recording, I shared with you, and listeners will know this too, that I had a series of blood and urine tests done recently and analyzed. And it was about 200 markers total that had been analyzed. And for the first time in my life, I did allergy testing just because I never had any reaction to anything, any noticeable reaction. And anything that I did, actually, I think that I'm allergic to grapefruit. Because my lips get a little tingly. So I don't eat grapefruit. So but nothing, I wasn't going into any kind of anaphylactic shock or anything. But I did this test, and I have been plant-based / vegan leaning for a number of years. And what came up really interesting for me is that I'm severely allergic to dairy and casein. I've heard it pronounced different ways. And I found it really interesting that my body was naturally going that way. And then I had evidence that my body was actually rejecting it. And you were describing to me kind of the process of, we talked about cheese. I want to go into this because I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Really kind of what casein is all about and the addictive properties of that and things like cheese. So can you talk about that for a moment?
Sure. I'll take a step back too and say it sounds like you might have had something called IgG testing. Does that sound familiar to you?
Only because someone else asked me that if it was IgG.
Just for listeners, the very standardly accepted testing for allergies and for allergy definition is something called IgE testing, immunoglobulin E. It's a response of the immune system to foods that can potentially include anaphylaxis. So significant allergies and sort of our image of the shrimp allergy, the peanut allergy that can get people into severe trouble. And that's really the only absolutely accepted allergy testing in medicine. It sounds like with a panel of 200 things, you might have had something called IgG, which more accurately is called sensitivity testing. It's a little bit more controversial in sort of the opinions of conventional allergy and immunology. But let me speak to the fact that in this testing, it indicated that you were having some sort of untoward, let's at least put it that way, response to casein. And you had mentioned this to me before we started chatting on air. And I sort of jokingly said, well, it's not a food for adults anyway. So casein is this particular protein found in mammals' milk, the milk produced for baby mammals, that has a particular ability to cross intact through the gut lining and make it into the bloodstream. So traditionally you'd eat proteins and they would get broken down into their constituent parts, the amino acids, and you'd absorb amino acids. But casein has a particular ability to get through the gut lining intact. And in fact, in baby mammals, the gut lining is pretty permeable. So it's easy for casein to get intact into the bloodstream. And in the bloodstream, it becomes casomorphin. It becomes a natural opiate substance that then travels to the brain and fits into opiate receptors and relaxes the baby mammal so that after it nurses, it can fall asleep. So people have observed babies being milk drunk, having nursed, but it's actually milk stoned. It's not alcohol. It's an opiate. And then babies wake up slightly in withdrawal, crying and wanting to nurse again. And it's a survival mechanism.
But it's okay in infants.
Yeah, particularly when it's their species milk.
Right,
That's always good. Yes.
But not powdered and not continuing to drink glasses of milk into adulthood.
Correct. Mm-hmm. So it sort of doesn't surprise me that you had a reaction to it. In fact, if I have to sort of think about what foods might be triggering somebody's symptoms, and it's not always food, but foods are big players. It's really gluten and casein that come up as sort of the most common triggers.
So, gosh, I've got a lot of questions on that line of gluten, because again, you hear a lot of different things. You hear people say they have to stay away from gluten. And then you hear probably reports from the wheat industry, and they say, really, it's a small percentage of people that need to stay away from it that are celiac. And I believe that that's true, that there's probably just a small percentage of people who have a very bad reaction to it. But the rest of us, our hips are telling us and our bodies are telling us that we are having a problem with gluten, because once you take gluten out of the picture, we're not puffy. We're not as puffy. Like I can just tell from my face when I've been off gluten and haven't eaten bread in a week.
Yeah. So, okay. So it sounds like you're gluten sensitive, and that's a real phenomenon. So let's think about sort of reactions to gluten. One is celiac disease. That's an autoimmune illness where the gluten proteins, the gliadin, they're technically the gliadin proteins, come into the body. The immune system sees them. It starts producing a reaction, and the reaction takes out the lining of the small intestine. It damages the lining of the small intestine. And the cure, the treatment, is to absolutely not expose yourself to gluten at all. So that's 1% of the population has celiac disease and should not be exposed to gluten at all. And it's the estimate that we have based on research is that 5% of the population has gluten sensitivity. And that's quite real, and we don't understand entirely how that's mediated, but the production of some sort of symptom in response to gluten in the diet, the symptom can occur really in any organ system in the body. Somebody can have GI symptoms, somebody can have brain symptoms, somebody can have a puffy face, somebody can have a skin rash.
Do you believe that that's only 5%?
Yeah.
Because more than 5% of my friends are telling me that they feel better when they're not on gluten.
You know, it's hard to know what precisely that means in terms of, if you think about getting off gluten, now you're not having donuts. Now you're not having pizza. Now, people might feel better. And it's hard to precisely attribute that to that this specific group of gliadin proteins is no longer in the diet. So yeah, because again, I have to believe in research. It's the only ground I can stand on. I believe the 5% for gluten sensitivity. And then we do have data that for the majority of people who aren't gluten sensitive and who don't have celiac, and I suppose there's a third thing, which is a wheat allergy, which is uncommon. We do have data that it is beneficial to eat whole grains that contain these proteins, rye, wheat, barley, farro, and so forth. It is food. The non-digestible carbohydrate components of it provide food for beneficial bacteria. It seems to be associated with less cardiovascular disease. So overall, probably most people tolerate it okay. Yeah.
Okay. To get back to the casein and the addictive nature of cheese specifically, because I had relayed to you that years ago when I started playing around with a more plant-based diet, I would start on Monday. I'd been vegetarian for years. I was pescatarian 28 years ago. So I was eating fish because shrimp was my downfall. I loved shrimp. Then I realized I could live without fish. And so just went vegetarian. And that was after a trip to India when I realized people there weren't eating any meat at all. Many of them aren't. So I figured I could try that as well. But I was playing around with completely plant-based, taking the dairy out. And so Monday, I'd be great. Tuesday, I'd be pretty good. Wednesday, I'd be starting to crave stuff. And by Thursday, I'd be going for a walk because I walk all the time. My husband and I go walk the neighborhood. We'd go walk to the grocery store and they'd have samples of cheese out. And I'd have to have cheese by Thursday. And you're saying that that's probably, there's some kind of addictive nature to that that's drawing me to that.
Right. So we talked about casein for baby mammals, and we talked about casein becoming an opiate in the bloodstream and going to the reward center of the brain and docking at opiate receptors and, relaxing the baby infant. And it actually has those effects in adults as well. And if you think about cheese versus dairy, you've just concentrated the casein because you've thrown out a bunch of water. So you've concentrated this protein in the cheese. And and the fast food industry, by the way, was told by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, put cheese on everything and people will keep coming back for more. So without sort of you recognizing it as an addiction, there is this background, neurochemical sense of well-being with eating the cheese and yearning for more.
Isn't there there's some kind of a Pizza Hut pizza or something that has a pound of cheese on it? Something absolutely crazy.
Right. Well, that's tolerance, right? Tolerance is, so the hallmarks of a substance, the hallmarks of what makes a substance addictive are three things: tolerance, craving, and withdrawal. And tolerance might mean, let's say I was on a desert island and for 20 years I've been eating roots and tubers, and occasionally I strangled a rabbit or something, and you picked me up in a helicopter and you gave me an Oreo. I would think that I had died and gone to heaven from the taste of the Oreo. And then back in civilization, I try to get that same feeling back. And at first it would take 5 Oreos and then a box of Oreos. And then I'm at the New Mexico State Fair having deep fried Oreos. That's tolerance. And so if you look at pizza that has a pound of cheese on it and sort of think gross, that's probably a good sign. It means you don't have that level of tolerance. But if people are eating lots and lots of cheese, ultimately it will take a little personal pizza with a pound of cheese on it to even begin to try to get the same opiate effect, because that's the nature of the homeostatic aspect of the opiate system.
I don't think I knew that about food. It's obvious about alcohol and tolerance and probably cigarettes as well. I might think that, or pot smoking or heroin. But I never thought about that in terms of the food, about having a tolerance and then actually literally craving more of it.
It was actually debated for a long time. Do we have the evidence to say that foods can be addictive? And now it's just sort of unequivocal. And to begin with, all drugs of abuse, there's no cocaine system in the brain. There's no tobacco system in the brain. All drugs of abuse hijack the food reward system and just hit on it much more powerfully than food does. But it's the food reward system that's there with the opiates.
Can you explain exactly what that is, the food reward?
Well, if you think about it, when just in a more natural environment, years of evolutionary history, we were meant to find certain foods more palatable because we weren't going to find them all the time. So, for example, fruits and berries in season are meant to be even more delicious to us than the roots and tubers and wild greens we might have more day in and day out, because we would only get them one season a year. So we're supposed to really kind of gorge on them. And then, it took a lot of effort to kill a wild animal, but if you did kill a wild animal, you were supposed to really want to eat, particularly the fat component of that, so that you would fill up, because around the next bend, there might be scarcity. And it might be a long time before you killed another animal or before you had sort of a copious amount of calories in front of you. So certain foods activate the food reward system. And that's an opiate-driven system. And it has to do with behavior and reinforcing behavior. And we live in a really difficult time in terms of that because of the modern ability to combine sugar, salt, and fat. Think about it. If you came to a honey hive, it was pure sort of sugar, there's only so much you'd want to eat at one time. And if you came to an avocado bush, now remember, there's no salt, there's no lemon juice, it's just a bush of avocados, or you killed a wild animal and all the fat is under the skin and in just pure fat, there's only so much you'd want to eat at once, or if you came to a salt lick. But when you start combining these foods, like it's nachos with sort of salty cheese and apple with smoked kind of sweet bacon, that can really override the satiety mechanism in the brain, the sense of being full, and you're getting just into the reward system, just the opiates. So one aspect of substances that can be addictive is there'll be a tolerance. The more that brain cells are awash in opiates, the fewer receptors for opiates you'll make, because the body's always trying to achieve homeostasis. So if you're eating these opiate-producing foods a lot, you're going to get fewer receptors, and it's going to take more and more opiates over time. And that's the same phenomenon that mediates withdrawal. If all of a sudden you remove the opiate flow, you reduce the opiate flow because you've reduced those foods, you have fewer receptors sort of crying out until, again, over time, and it takes 3 to 5 to 7 days, you start making more receptors to sort of meet the lower, more appropriate level of opiates. But there's been some interesting experiments. You can use the opiate blocker we use in the emergency room. We give people an injection of naloxone, and it'll sit on the opiate receptors. And then you offer people, we've tried it with meat, we've tried it with sugar, chocolate, and dairy, cheese. You offer people those foods and they're no longer interested. Yeah.
Are they looking at this as a weight loss program? Actually,
there is a medication that involves that in terms of weight loss, but this was research done a long time ago, just again looking at the sort of interaction between those particular foods and the food reward system. So, it's very problematic because we're just surrounded by these hyper palatable foods that just the body finds very, very delicious because we were sort of very intermittently exposed to them.
So how would you recommend that someone take control of their diet? So with conflicting information, we end up confused and just stifled. Like we don't know what to do because there's so much information and misinformation. And what we want to do is we want to look at the research that fits with our diet. So if we read something that says 2 glasses of wine a night is actually good for you and you're a drinker already, then you're going to use that as justification. So somebody who does want to get healthier and not necessarily lose weight, but they just want to get healthier, where do they even start?
I'd say that there's a recent trend in nutrition research. Well, there's a bit of an older trend that's important to mention, which is that for ages, we looked at protein, carbohydrate, and fat and tried to figure out the perfect ratio, and it would really vary greatly between different people. And it had this sort of faulty underlying premise, which is that a bowl of beans is equivalent to a bowl of hot dogs, and that a sweet potato was sort of equivalent to flaming hot Cheetos. And it was just fundamentally wrong. So we got away from that and started looking at entire dietary patterns. And again, I've mentioned that if one is honest in the field of nutrition, in terms of dietary pattern, the balance of the evidence, the preponderance of the evidence is that the more whole plant food rich, the more fruits and vegetables and beans and whole grains and nuts and seeds and herbs and spices and mushrooms and so forth, better health outcomes are. And then more recently, there's been an effort to move away from looking at sort of the costs of, let's just say, bad food, unhealthful food. If you have a diet of sort of cheeseburgers and fries, what does that mean in terms of outcomes? And ask, what does it mean that there has been an absence of beneficial foods? So if you're eating cheeseburgers and fries, we can say, okay, that's problematic. But it sort of also means that you've had the absence of the plant kingdom with its thousands of biologically beneficial compounds that we talked about the plant makes in its own defense, and the fact that throughout human history, it is the non-digestible fibrous components of plants that we don't absorb, we can't absorb, that has made it into our colon and that feeds beneficial bacteria. So what does it mean that people aren't getting those foods? So Americans get, on average, 1.7 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. And by far, the number one vegetable is potatoes, and that's not like artisanal.
And that's in French fries.
It's not artisanal purple potatoes with rosemary. It's French fries. And we actually have a quantity. We know sort of 8 to 10 fruits and vegetables a day prevents heart disease. And I always like giving the example. If I told you I had oatmeal and blueberries and a banana for breakfast and a big salad with chicken for lunch and yogurt for a snack and salmon and broccoli for dinner, I still wouldn't be at 8 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. So we think of that as really healthy, but it's relatively healthy. The diet, the day's eating plan I just gave you, it's relatively healthy compared to what most Americans are eating, but it's still not good enough for disease prevention in a really robust way. So, the question of how to do it is $1 million question. There hasn't been a lot of research money poured into that. There are some sort of gradual approaches. Meatless Monday is a campaign which has both an environmental bent to it. If Americans gave up meat one day a week, it's been shown that the effect on greenhouse gas would be equivalent to everyone handing in their cars and SUVs and getting hybrid vehicles, but also sort of for its health benefits. So that's sort of one campaign. So it hasn't really been studied. My personal experience is when you make small changes, you see small effects. And sometimes it's really nice to take a time-limited amount of time that sort of is doable to most people, like a 3-week period of time, and make a radical change, and because people can see dramatic effects.
Such as a cleanse.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people are familiar with cleanses, like a 7-day or 10-day cleanse.
We could use that term, or what I've done with hundreds of people is ask them to have a completely whole foods plant-based diet for 3 weeks where we prepare for it in advance. I always say sort of digest the information first with your cerebral cortex, read about it, think about it, set a start date. I tell people they can feel worse in the first 3 to 5 to 7 days because of that withdrawal phenomenon. And there's sort of another aspect of detoxification where you can actually feel worse initially. But then in the second 2 weeks, it's hard for me to predict what any given individual will feel. But typically people are feeling something that they really like. And it is that positivity that then can inform what they decide to do next. But when people, let's say they decide to add back in dairy or meat or what have you, we have radically changed their baseline and they're still eating far more plant foods than they had before. But often people feel so much better that they maintain a diet that's similar to that. But human nature isn't really good with the idea of the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. That's just a really harsh idea. So a 3-week thing and then deciding what you want to do over the next week. And then the week after that can be really effective. Again, it's my nature to only stand on the research because as a physician nutritionalist, I can't say, Beth, you ought to do this because I feel better doing it, or Beth, you ought to do this because my trainer told me it would be a good idea to do and you should do it. I have to stand on the research. And we just have a limited amount of money being spent on how to shift towards a more plant-rich diet. Although, again, we do have all the evidence that is the way to eat. We've looked at it in the workplace. The workplace seems to be a really wonderful place to have people make change because you spend so much time there. People do a lot of eating there. They do a lot of talking about how they're burdened by what they're eating there. So I really enjoy a workplace setting. I've had a lot of experience of having people in a workplace do the 3 weeks and having certain people get reluctantly brought along with the rest of their coworkers and then end up having a fabulous experience.
Well, that's nice because then they have a support system
it's
and
right
accountability.
There, 8 or 9 hours a day. And people are doing potlucks, and instead of bringing in the Frito pies here in New Mexico, they're bringing in these gorgeous plant-based dishes, and that's a really fun setting.
That's neat.
Hey,
let's talk about, I know the answer to this, or I think I know the answer to this, but I want to bring it up because I'm still amazed that to this day, actually just this last week, I got asked this very question about, on a plant-based diet, where do you get your protein?
Okay.
So first, where does one get their protein? And do you have a recommendation for the average person, not an elite athlete, but just an average person who wants to make a change, how many grams of protein they should be having on a daily basis?
Yeah, I don't even think about it that way. The World Health Organization says that human beings need 5 to 10% of their calories from protein. And as an aside, I tell people constantly, you have never visited someone in the hospital because they've had too little protein. You've never given someone your condolences on the loss of the loved one because of too little protein. Mm-hmm. But you probably have visited someone in the hospital or given someone condolences because of the presence of too much protein in the American diet. So there's a lot of mythology around protein. But in terms of the grams question, when we start talking about 5 to 10% of your calories and you're eating a diversity of whole plant foods in the course of the day, then I'm going to tell you that your vegetables are 5 to 50% protein, and your grains and beans on average are 25% protein, and your nuts and seeds are somewhere around there. And I guess if you only ate fruit all day long, day in, day out.
And there are fruitarians.
There are. Mm-hmm. That you might have a little bit of trouble getting to the 5 to 10% of the calories from protein. But if you eat fruits and vegetables and beans and whole grains in the course of the day, nature has done it for you. you don't have to give this scientific construct, which requires a lab with sophisticated testing to tell you the presence of this particular type of chemical. Nature has put an absolutely beautiful amount of protein into those foods for you. And, entire populations have lived successfully on only potatoes because potatoes are 7% protein. They're between 5 to 10% protein. I'm not saying people should go out and do that, but I'm sort of trying to lower the bar in terms of our perception about protein.
Well, the interesting thing that I find about that is that when a person asks me where I get my protein, and they're concerned about my protein level, I ask them if they know how many grams of protein they get in a day or how many they should have. And they have no idea. And I don't think it's a fair question to ask unless you know it of yourself.
Right.
So I just kind of turn it back on them.
There is a number for men and for women, 45 grams for women and 55 for men. It's really irrelevant if you're eating whole plant foods. And, I just reflect on being here in Albuquerque at the Rio Grande Zoo and seeing the daily 3:30 feeding of the 4,000-pound hippopotami, and the keeper was throwing entire heads of romaine lettuce and yams, and he said if he had a pumpkin, he could throw the whole pumpkin into their jaws. If he had a watermelon, he could throw the whole watermelon in. And these gorgeous 4,000-pound animals are eating fruits and vegetables and hay. Mm-hmm. And that's how they're 4,000 pounds. I mean,
if we could, we'd be eating them.
Well,
if it was legal.
There's this obsession, and the obsession actually has a cultural origin, which is pretty fascinating, which is when the European colonial powers came from Europe to places like Africa and South America. What they saw were leaner, shorter men eating largely vegetarian diets. And they said, look at us, we're taller, we're bigger, we have more strength, we're more powerful, and we're eating our roast beef and our steaks. And, these sort of plant foods are making these smaller men. Well, as it turns out, so there's this sort of cultural association between meat and largeness and strength. As it turns out, we're supposed to be lean, and actually height is an indication of relative overnutrition in childhood. So I'm 5'10". I wasn't a chubby baby, but I was given more food than human beings needed from an evolutionary perspective. And so Americans on average are taller, and there is some genetic component, but there's a huge nutritional component. Well, as it turns out, with increasing height is significantly increased risk for all our modern diseases. So as one gets taller, one is at significantly increased risk for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, pulmonary embolism. This is a very well-established phenomenon in medicine. So my risk for these diseases at 5'10" is significantly higher than the same exact me with the same exact diet and lifestyle if I were 5'5"
or me at 5'2",
or than you at 5'2". Mm-hmm. So we're supposed to have the body morphology of the people the Europeans were encountering. So, there's this sort of a lot of mythos around the idea that the chicken goes to your biceps. And for a long time, we've known about animal foods and negative health outcomes, and we know about saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. But now it's becoming very clear that animal protein per se yields negative health outcomes. So it's this increased animal protein, but not protein from vegetable sources. And I always ask people, where is protein in vegetable sources? And the answer is in every last fruit and vegetable and bean and whole grain and nut and seed and herbs and spices is protein. That's where the cow gets it. That's where the chicken gets it. So with increasing animal protein, there is significantly increased risk of dying of any cause. And then they look specifically at cardiovascular mortality, the number one cause of death. And it's significantly increased. The more animal protein, the more death from cardiovascular disease, and the more animal protein, the more death from cancer. So we really need to sort of get over our obsession with it, and as this sort of healthful positive unto itself.
Yeah. It's funny, when I go to a restaurant and I order a salad, I often do it if there's not a big salad on the menu, there's just starters or a house salad. I say, can you just ask the chef to make the biggest salad he or she can make? Just like whatever you've got, double it and just make a big salad. and they'll say, do you want a protein on it?
Ugh,
and
protein.
I'll say,
that makes me crazy.
and I say, no, it comes with the protein.
Yeah.
It's already in there.
Yeah,
and they're, huh? Like they don't get it.
The phrase a protein is...
because they think chicken or salmon or something.
Right. And then there'll be the vegetarian one, which will be the tofu. And you just have a diversity of plant foods and it's taken care of. You don't have to think about having beans or having tofu. It's all beautiful. It's right there in your salad. The basis of your salad is a quarter protein. It's all perfect. And it's vegetable protein, which seems to signal the body in a beneficial way. Whereas animal protein, in a complex way, it's a signal of abundance, which acts then in turn as a growth promoter. And growth promotion is not positive for our health. It's associated with cancer and other negative health outcomes. So, yeah, people just sort of have to get over that.
I know. So you mentioned earlier when we first started talking that you're an Instapot fan. And I know a lot of people have them now. I don't have one yet. I'm not sure if I'm going to go down that path or not, but tell me what do you cook in your Instapot?
I tell people, because, they're like, oh, I'd eat plant-based if I had a personal chef. And I'm like, I'm a haphazard cook and a haphazard eater. I just haphazardly cook and eat out of the plant kingdom. But I did buy one. It was like $69 at Target. And, I was really afraid of it. It sat on the counter for a month. And I think any of us who grew up with pressure cookers with the little thing rattling with steam coming out
Screaming.
of it and occasionally exploding probably has an appropriate fear of it. But the beautiful part about it is that you can soak some beans. It's still good to soak them overnight, but then you throw it into the Instant Pot and you turn it on. You close it. You press beans. You put some water in. Maybe you want to put some, some onion or something. But you turn it on, you press beans, and half an hour later, the beans are perfectly cooked.
No waiting an hour and a half or whatever time.
Or, 8 hours in a slow cooker. The beets I had today, literally, I cut them up. I put a tiny bit of water in. I closed it. And 5 minutes later, they were perfectly cooked.
Okay.
So lately, because strawberries and rhubarb have been in the markets, I chop up some rhubarb and throw in strawberries. And 5 minutes later, there's this beautiful strawberry rhubarb sauce. And
yum.
Soups, you throw in a bunch of vegetables and maybe some lentils that I, sort of haven't soaked. So they're easy to just throw in, and half an hour later there's soup. So, it's good.
You might have just sold me on an Instapot.
It's worth trying. It's worth trying.
I think so. And it's relatively inexpensive in terms of cost.
Correct.
For the amount of use I think a person can get out of it. So I just know they're wildly popular. Everybody's cooking in them. Hey, I have a question. You're citing some research and you're very knowledgeable about these things. Wherever you're getting your information, is that accessible to just me and to the average listener? Or are you finding this information in, I don't know, the American Medical Association or, a journal of some kind?
So I do tell people about PubMed.gov, which is the National Library of Medicine, because, when you pull that up, it comes up with a search box. And you can put anything into that search box and you're going to get every peer-reviewed medical journal article about it. And even if you don't understand, and you'll get the titles, and then if you want to, you can click on the titles and you'll get an abstract. And even if it's not perfectly comprehensible, it gives you an indication of the research. So here's a nice example. I showed someone this. She said, what about the blood type diet? And I said, well, I can only stand on the medical research. So let's check it out. And by the way, the absence of research doesn't mean something's not true. I will say that, but I'm not a conspiracy theorist either. And I do think that when things have validity, that scientific researchers want to study them. And I give the example there of studies in mistletoe. And in the European herbal tradition, for hundreds of years, it was noticed that this plant, this sort of parasitic plant, could live as an entity on a tree. And it looked sort of like a mass, like cancer. And mistletoe was used for that reason as an anti-cancer remedy. Because if the tree could tolerate mistletoe, maybe there's some way you could tolerate a mass in your body. So completely based on what we would sort of consider kind of a more primitive thinking. But if you go to PubMed.gov and you put in mistletoe and cancer, you're going to see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles. because mistletoe is, in fact, the most widely used herbal or complementary cancer treatment in Europe. The research is really out of Europe, because the mistletoe does actually have cytotoxic, cancer-killing properties and quality of life improvement properties. So you're going to see that it's been studied hundreds and hundreds of times, and hundreds of articles will show up. But when we put in blood type diet, 3 articles showed up. All 3 of them, their conclusion was that after the research they had done, they could conclude there was no evidence for this diet. So PubMed.gov is a really useful thing. I also really love, I think Michael Greger does a beautiful job on nutritionfacts.org.
That's a fantastic site.
Nutritionfacts.org is a completely free resource where every day he produces a 2 to 6 minute video. If you don't have time to watch the video, they're wonderful to watch. You can just click on transcript and read it, where he goes over 10 to 20 journal articles, peer-reviewed scientific articles about a topic in nutrition and explains the research. At this point in time, there's thousands of topics he's already done a video on, so you can go to his website and put in arthritis or put in cancer
vitamin
or put
E,
in
vitamin D.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just a gift. It's a beautiful resource. He also wrote a brilliant book called How Not to Die, where it's sort of a compendium of research.
I've given that book to more people.
Right.
And what I'll do is I'll put a little Post-it note in the section where I think it's relevant to that person. Just because you don't need to read the whole thing. It's How Not to Die of Heart Disease, How Not to Die of Cancer, How Not to Die of Brain Cancer or breast cancer. And it's just...
Right. And that's where you get into this sort of best kept secret in medicine, this sort of shamefully kept secret in medicine, which is how powerful diet is in terms of prevention. And we absolutely know for all the stuff that goes on in doctors' offices that the absolute unequivocal number one cause of death in the United States, the root cause of death, is what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Global Burden of Disease report calls dietary risk. We may not acknowledge that it's the same as we all have a sort of perception about cigarette smoking, perhaps, but we don't have a sense that how we are eating day in and day out is the number one risk behavior for basically premature death, which is sort of all deaths that aren't like in your 90s in your sleep.
Sally, why do you think that is?
That people don't have that perception? Oh, I mean, I think there's lots of reasons. First of all, the food industry is an enormous industry. It is underpinned by a farm bill that subsidizes corn, wheat, and soy, which provides an influx of artificially cheap sugar and fat into the food supply. The fat is the corn oil and the soybean oil and the fact that you can have a 99-cent cheeseburger because you feed your animals artificially cheap corn and soy, and the sugar is the high fructose corn syrup and the white bun of the burger where you've thrown away the bran and the germ. And so we have the ability to make processed food super cheaply, whereas produce isn't subsidized, and that's sort of at one end of the supermarket, and everything else is made artificially cheaply. And then we can make these hyper palatable foods that go directly to the reward center by using specific combinations of sugar, salt, and fat. And then we lure people, at every street corner, there's the opportunity to eat these foods. And there's a $30 billion advertising campaign. And the case has been made, that there are good people in the food industry, in the medical industry, and in the pharmaceutical industry. But these are 3 enormous industries that depend on each other's presence that would be, enormously threatened by everyone shifting to a plant-based diet. The pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry sort of depend on people being sickened by the food industry.
That's not just conspiracy theory.
Well, I mean, again, I think in any given individual can't even, working in those industries, might not see that big picture. I'm not putting down people at an individual level, but systemically, there's this sort of interdependence.
I totally agree with you.
And misinformation. I'll never forget, I was at a Little League game and a mom was feeding her infant antioxidant cherry 7-Up. And so you take, you take cherry 7-Up, which gives you an enormous oxidative burst. You've overwhelmed the mitochondria with sugar. The mitochondria create a whole bunch of oxidative free radicals. and then you throw a little bit of vitamin C or something into the soda to quench those, and you've just completely confused the consumer. It's an effort to sell something. So ultimately, greed is a very bad player here, because I don't really judge people. I feel like often people don't have a lot of choice. New York City, when they decided to put calorie counts on all their menus, and people objected and said it was the nanny state, and people should just be able to choose what they want. And I think people don't. They don't have an enormous amount of choice. They're being marketed to.
And now when you go into a Starbucks and you see that slice of cake is 450 calories, or the muffin, you're shocked.
Yeah.
People make better choices.
Right. People need more education because they're sort of left choiceless. The choice is sort of 7-Up or cherry 7-Up.
Yeah.
That becomes sort of what people are surrounded by.
To get back to the information, one other thing, I don't know if you follow Rhonda Patrick and her website Found My Fitness. And she posts several times a day, I think, links to articles. I don't think that she's producing the articles, all of the articles, or any of the articles herself, but she'll link to articles. And I just keep that in my browser on my phone. And rather than pulling up Facebook or pulling up, a social media site, I'll pull that up just for some information and find out what's new.
I'm not, I haven't really gone to it, but her name keeps coming up. So
yeah,
I will trust your evaluation on that.
Yeah, she's got good scientific articles.
Right.
And like you said, sometimes these scientific articles are way beyond me. There'll be abstracts, but there'll be enough from the headline that I can then go do, just do a search, and then there'll be information that expands on it in English that I can actually understand.
Right.
So that's good. Yeah.
Right.
Are there any consumer shows that you know of, like a trade show where a person might go to find out more information and see speakers about this, about a plant-based topic? I know there's Veg Fest.
Veg Fest is really the one that comes to mind that people seem to love.
Yeah, and there's a few of them around the country.
Right. I mean, there's the big sort of national one in Pennsylvania every summer that apparently is this phenomenal experience. But I think regionally, now there's Veg Fest everywhere. We
have one in Seattle, I know, yeah.
On the regional level. And now there are just these emerging medical conferences. So there's, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, sort of 2,000 physicians who understand that lifestyle change is this profound medicine. But there is the Plantrition Project. Loma Linda University does an annual conference, so that I think everyone is sort of welcome to. We just had one in Albuquerque that in 2019 is going to be in North Carolina, and it's sort of plant-based medical conference. And so that's another great sort of resource people can go to. I think that'd be, it's sort of delightful to do those things, because I think there's a lot of joy around eating this way.
Yeah.
And, that can be a really infectious thing. And that's the really beautiful part about it. I call it sort of concentric circles of goodness to the diet. If I have someone come to me for a health reason, for example, shifting to a plant-based diet is this profoundly beneficial thing to do for cancer survivors, because from a more conventional medical perspective, when people are done with treatment, we say, good luck with that. We'll monitor you to see if the cancers come back or not. And that is a very anxiety-provoking state to live in. So if you can do something proactively, that's just this beautiful place to put that anxiety into this positivity. So I'll recommend that to my patients who are cancer survivors. And then these concentric circles of goodness are that this same diet, well, to begin with, it's delicious. It's absolutely delicious, but it's also the one that's best for the environment. And for some people, now that's an additional sort of source of meaning. And it's the most compassionate way to eat. And that becomes an additional positive and source of meaning. So there's just lots of goodness about it that people sort of can use as an entree, and then just sort of deepens the experience of it. Sometimes just thinking concretely about just counting fruits and vegetables or servings of plant foods, or looking at it concretely, sometimes that's really helpful for people. And actually, our hero, Dr. Michael Greger, has an app called The Daily Dozen, where you can sort of chart how many servings of beans did you have, how many servings of, he recommends that you have berries every day. He recommends cruciferous vegetables every day.
We have that posted on our refrigerator.
Right. How many servings of other vegetables did you have? How many fruits did you have? How much water did you drink? And absolutely, if it's not you achieve 100% every day, can you play a little game with yourself and sort of try to progressively improve that? And I'll often just reflect on sort of what I ate for the day. And I sort of feel good when, I can say that I had tons of sprouts and a whole head of beets. And there's sort of an aesthetic beauty to the plant kingdom. Nobody looks at still lives of like sausages or hot dogs, And so, there is a real beauty to, and it's fun to sort of go over and reflect on what I might have had in the course of a day. So that can be an entree into it for people as well.
If there's people on Instagram, and maybe I'll dig up a couple of the links to this, but when you talk about the beauty of the food, I know that there are some Instagrammers who are doing amazing things in the plant-based eating world that are just beautiful.
Right.
And I'll link to a couple of those. Sapna Chandra, I interviewed her for the podcast. And she's often featured in Thrive magazine, which is a plant-based magazine. She's got beautiful photography, and there's some other ones too that are just amazing.
Right.
And it's just inspirational when you look at these, and like, it's just vibrant, and the colors just amazing.
Yeah, I think we're meant to be attracted. We co-evolved with the plant kingdom. We absolutely depended on the plant kingdom. And, I think we're supposed to be attracted to it. And we have so many sort of smoke screens in our way with these sort of addictive and hyper-palatable foods being peddled to us at every turn. But there is, this great beauty to it.
Since this is the Be Bold podcast, what's one way that someone could be bold with their eating choices? What would your recommendation be?
I love the dramatic change for a limited period of time. I just seen it be so wonderful for so many people. And again, there's no commitment to staying eating that way the rest of your life. You're talking about 3 weeks. You get to just choose what happens after it. But just doing it, people say, I could never eat that way. Well, you can. And you can for 3 weeks. Let's give it a try. And people do it, and they feel good, and they've done it, and they enjoy it, and they feel satisfied. They're full with their meals, and they sort of can't believe that they did it. So I love that. And, Dr. Neil Barnard has 21-day Kickstart online. 500,000 people have done it. It's a 3-week program. You can sign up and you get sort of daily emails and a meal planner and tips. And that can be a way to do it. Mm-hmm. Also completely free.
Yeah, great.
People in the plant-based world tend to do things for free because it's the right thing. It's the right message.
True, right.
Yeah.
Well, great. Thanks for that. I appreciate it. Thanks for your time today, too.
Absolutely.
So great to see you again.
Beth, an absolute pleasure to see you.
I look forward to seeing you again down here or come up to Seattle and come visit.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll show you around to some of the best plant-based restaurants that we have.
Absolutely fabulous idea.
Great. Thanks, Sally. I love that she calls her cooking and her eating haphazard because it really takes the pressure off in terms of thinking that we have to be perfect in the kitchen in order to eat healthy. And that is just not the case. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it on social media, and you can use the hashtag BeBold or simply just share the info with a friend. These conversations are so important, and I love knowing that more and more people are getting to hear them. So please be a part of that community and help me spread the word. I'm in search of guests for the podcast, so if you know of anyone or you yourself would be a good fit, simply fill out the guest submission form on the BeBoldPodcast.com website. Now, I only record in person, and that's often in Seattle, but as you know, I travel a lot, and that gives me the chance to meet up with people on the road. For show notes, check out the BeBoldPodcast.com website for each episode, and also sign up for email alerts each time a new episode comes out. While you're online, go to the Be Bold Podcast Facebook page and give that a like. You can connect with me by friending me on Facebook. I'm Wandergal on Instagram and Wanderluster on Twitter. Now, I don't tweet a lot, but I have been adding the new episodes each time they come out on Twitter. So if you are a tweeter, you can find that information there. I've got about 25,000 followers, so I figured why not spread the word there as well. You can find out more about me by visiting wanderlustandlipstick.com. Sign up for my newsletter on the Wanderlust and Lipstick site, and you'll receive a series of tips for making your travels safer. You can find out about the tours I lead at wandertours.com. We've got a couple of women-only tours to India coming up. One to North India this fall and one to South India early next year. Space is limited on both of those. Or if you'd like to join me in Papua New Guinea, you can do that in 2019. Ladies, you can join us on our Be Bold Facebook group. We've got over 2,600 members in that group, and it's a community of amazing women who are sharing their wins, they're asking questions, they're sharing their struggles, they're getting feedback and encouragement from the community. Basically, we're learning from each other and just sharing some great information. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Be Bold podcast. Until next time, be bold.